So you might recall that Emerson opens his 1836 essay, Nature, thus: Our age is retrospective. It builds the sepulchres of the fathers. It writes biographies, histories, and criticism. And then you might recall that for the remainder of that essay, and indeed in other essays such as American Scholar and Self Reliance, Emerson is calling upon his readers to try to shake off the past, to make it new, to focus on the present moment, and out of that present moment create a future that is fresh, a future that is unprecedented, perhaps a future that could not even be predicted. In other words, Emerson is constantly emphasizing originality, creativity, and newness. When we shift to Hawthorne, who was born 1 year after Emerson, we see a writer not of nonfiction, but a writer of fiction. We see a writer who may want to shake off the past and foster originality and creativity, but a writer who knows that he cannot. So with Hawthorne, we need to get from the very beginning that this is a writer whose primary theme, at least in his first two novels and in many of his short stories before the novels, this is a writer whose primary theme is the power of the past to shape the present. And in most cases, the power of the past to pollute the present. So Hawthorne's view, we might say, is tragic in that his starting point is that we are born into a world of sins that have come before us, but sins that will be visited upon us. And we are most likely to repeat those sins. And it is likely that our ancestors will, or our offspring rather, will repeat those sins. So for Hawthorne, the problem becomes, how does one live in this world? How does one come into a world knowing that he will be shaped by the past and not allow the past to turn him into his ancestors, especially if his ancestors were destructive, sinful, evil, we might even say. That's the kind of language Hawthorne would use. And Hawthorne had some ancestors who did some pretty terrible things. I'll talk about that in just a minute. If you read Scarlet Letter, you know that before the narrative starts, Hawthorne provides a sketch of his time working in the Custom House in Salem, Massachusetts. He was born in Salem, Massachusetts, of course, one of the oldest settlements in America. He spent some time living outside of Salem. Of course, he went to college up in Maine, Bowdoin College. He spent some time living in Concord, where he hung out with Emerson and Thoreau. Wasn't too impressed with Emerson, kind of like Thoreau. But he found himself back in Salem, working in a government post as surveyor of goods coming in and out of Salem. And in this opening sketch called The Custom House, he says, I grew up in Salem, and even though I tried to get away from Salem, I find myself in Salem again. My roots in Salem are deep, and they're not necessarily very admirable. His great-great-great-grandfather, William Hawthorne, Hathorne, no W, William Hawthorne, came over to New England in 1630 on the Arabella, on the famous ship on which John Winthrop himself came over, and became a sort of puritanical, devout figure who was admired for his faith, but also who was violent. William Hawthorne was notorious for punishing heretics, and famously he was especially cruel to a Quaker woman. So Hawthorne describes that in The Custom House. And then he says, well, my great-great-grandfather, John Hawthorne, was actually involved in the Salem witch trials. So he persecuted these people, mainly women, who were accused of being witches, of course, with no proof at all. So in these two cases, these men, these ancestors, have done some horrific things, and Hawthorne worries, am I going to repeat what they have done? Is there a way that I can somehow move beyond this past, somehow that I can not repeat this past? And what happens? Well, in the course of his employment, he has some free time and he goes upstairs into the attic of the custom house. Now, this is not necessarily true. This is something he's imagining for the sake of framing Scarlet Letter. And there he's doing research. He finds all these old papers, all these old documents from way back when, back from the days of his great-great-great-great-grandfather's great-great-grandfather. And indeed, Hawthorne, I should say, after he left college, spent a good long time back in Salem, living in his parents' household with his sisters, with his mother. His dad had passed on by then, and spending almost all of his daytime hours in libraries, studying about the history of Salem, the history of New England, how the Puritans, the first settlers, shaped the landscape, the horrendous acts of these Puritan settlers, persecution of people who didn't believe as they, persecution of Native Americans, of course, persecution of women accused of witchcraft. So he was a deep student of history. So he imagines himself in this custom house in Salem doing some research of old documents. And he finds, so he says, in that cache of materials, a scarlet A. And he holds it to his breast and he feels this burn. And included with the A is what he says, the story of Hester Prynne. And of course, what does he do? He takes this moment from the past, this A, and this narrative by a former surveyor, Surveyor Pugh, P-U-E, and he uses it as an occasion to spin his own version of Hester Prynne's story, which is, of course, the novel The Scarlet Letter. Now, again, this is a fictional framework. This did not happen, very likely, and Hawthorne did not really find an A, but he's dramatizing here a way that the writer, at least in his mind, can respect the past, but not be controlled by the past. So this story happened in a region that shaped him. This story happened, the story of Hester Prynne, in a region in which his ancestors did horrific things. And instead of simply saying, oh, well, I'm going to repeat what they've done in my own way, or instead of simply saying, I'm going to escape my roots by moving away somewhere, he says, this is who I am. I'm a man shaped by this region. I'm a man shaped by these ancestors, but I have a choice about how I will tell the stories of the past. So if a bare narrative of the story of Hester Prynne might paint her as an adulteress who deserved to stand on the scaffold and wear the Scarlet Letter, Hawthorne will tell her story in such a way that he delves into the psychological complexity of Scarlet and of Dimmesdale and the Chillingworth, and turns this raw narrative into a moral tale that delves deep into the mysteries of the human heart. So this is Hawthorne's primary move, acknowledging the past, the weight of the past, but then through his psychological acuity, reimagining the stories of the past in such a way that they become these flexible, profound explorations of what it means to be a human being. And in doing this, ultimately Hawthorne will open out new space, new areas in which to exist. Now, what does this have to do with what we're reading, The House of Seven Gables? Well, obviously a lot. Scarlet Letter and House of Seven Gables are quite similar in this way. They both are delving into the past. And House of Seven Gables in particular, the characters are dealing with a curse from the past. Pynchon accuses Matthew Mall of witchcraft and has him hung so he can take over his property. Before Matthew Mall dies, he places a curse on Pynchon and his bloodline. So the very story begins with these people, many centuries later, dealing with a past of violence, a past of deception, and a past of curses and ill will. And all of this is connected to this house. So this house isn't literally haunted like we would see in a horror movie, but it is psychologically haunted. It's a house that has borne much pain, much sorrow. And here's Hetzibah, the last of a line, living there, barely eking out a living with this tiny little depressing shop. And then Phoebe comes along, a relative from the country, and brings something fresh and new into this world. And of course, there's a daguerreotypist or a primitive photographer living in this house of the Seven Gables, Holgrave. Turns out he's not only Holgrave. We'll go into that in a bit. But the novel is very much about how can we move beyond the curses of the past. Now, the final point. When Hawthorne was in his 20s, he started signing his name not Hathorne as his ancestors had, all the way up to the time of his father. His father died when he was quite young, a sailor. He starts putting the W in his name. He puts a letter in his name as a way, obviously, to separate himself from his ancestors. Now, he doesn't come up with a totally new name. He keeps the name, but just makes it different in the way it's spelled and slightly different in the way it sounds. So this becomes a kind of symbolic act, and it becomes a metaphor, we might say, for Hawthorne as a writer, trying to find, through the arrangement of letters, his writing, his fiction, a way to, again, acknowledge the past, but see it in such a way that it is not merely destructive and limiting, but an opportunity for thinking about meaning and perhaps new ways and more beneficial, healthy ways to engage the world.